you used to talk a lot. That's what he said. And then Master said, oh, well, you were happy then. Just sort of flowing with whatever, the unexamined life. So in that context, Swami made the remark that most people just live in delusion. Most people are wrong. And this was not directed at me personally. It was a general statement. If you ever become popular, remember that. You know, it's like you cannot take your self-worth from any source except your own inner relationship with God. And we cannot know what's true just because we want it to be true. And I relived my life over 4 weeks, and I watched myself learn. And I watched Swamiji lovingly and patiently dismantle my tightly held, but based on nothing, ideas about things, and gradually fill me with what, very simply, he learned from Master. Because Swamiji was in just the same position. He was a brilliant man. As a young man, 20 years ago, when I wrote the first book I wrote about Swami, which turned out, well, it was just a different book. It was a book of stories. I interviewed friends and family at Swamiji's suggestion. So I got to hear a little bit about what he was like when he was a young man. One woman who actually, as a girl, lived in their household and was a family friend. And Swamiji had a brother who was younger than him, but only by like a year and a half. And that brother was an extrovert and extremely popular and very dynamic. His name was Bob, actually. And my friend, unfortunately, I can't remember her name, but their mutual friend, she said, with Bob, you'd talk about the latest music and who was going out with who and the gossip about school and teachers. With Don, which was what Swami was called, you never talked like that. With Don, you only talked about serious subjects. You only talked about philosophy. And this was high school that we're talking about. You never were frivolous with him. And she even went so far as to say he and his mother had a very tight connection. He was born into the family for his mother. They were very, very close. And she said that the two of them had this aura. They just shared something. And she was a very spiritual person, too, in her way. And she said that they stood apart, she said, in some subtle way from the whole family. And so Swami always had this tremendous power within him. And he had great confidence in himself, and it was not unjustified. But he understood that true wisdom, he did not possess true wisdom. And he was desperate. In 1948, he reads Autobiography of a Yogi. 1948, think about where the world was at that time. I reread Autobiography of a Yogi also, which I read parts of. It's been a long time since I opened it on page 1 and read to the last page. I highly recommend it. Not that you wouldn't have thought of it yourself, but I highly recommend it. And so somehow Master's reality was very vivid in my mind, and I just had this picture of Swami Kriyananda, a very privileged white American WASP, actually, not even Jewish like me, where we're a little bit radical. He was just right in the middle of the American culture. The age of 22, the promising first son of a very prominent family, well-established family. His father goes to Egypt to work. He helps his mother pack up the house. He puts his mother on the boat. She's sailing out across the Atlantic in 1948, when you couldn't just pick up a cell phone and sort of get a conversation. And Swami always said that God took them away. The same day he picks up Autobiography of a Yogi, a week later he's kneeling in front of Master, being initiated as a monk and a disciple. Even just the fact that Master was Indian I mean, Swamiji had grown up in Romania and in Europe. He hadn't been anywhere in the East yet. He'd been in Western Europe. So he wasn't as provincial as someone who never left Iowa. But nonetheless, Master was a small, rather round man who spoke with a thick Bengali accent and had long hair. Of course, he looked perfectly natural in the country he came from, but he stood out here. And yet, there was something there that caused this young man, who himself said he was astonished by the words he was speaking. And he emphatically said he never thought in his lifetime he would say those words to anyone. All of these are stories, excuse me just a moment. All of these are stories and ideas. I mean, I could have told you that story in 1971, could have repeated the whole thing. But when you really stand back and think about what I'm trying to say is ego is what I'm really talking about. Like, what makes us so sure about anything? About the habits that this is the way I've always thought, so this is what must be true. This is what everybody thinks, so this must be true. This is what I'm afraid not to think, because what would I do then? What would be the implications if I actually examined my reality and made my decisions according to a higher value? Swamiji said he was so stunned by what had happened to him. He said before he read autobiography, he didn't even know the word guru. I mean, not deeply, not chakras, not karma, not reincarnation, not kundalini, and nowadays, even if you're still in Iowa, you know all these words. I've seen national comedy, mainstream national comedy, that can joke about gurus and chakras and meditating, and goofy yogis, which tells you that everybody now doesn't understand it, but they're familiar with it. It's right there with them. But for Swamiji, it was entirely new. When Master said, Master said, my vibrations. The picture Swami got was that he was standing on some kind of a jiggling machine, and because that was the only concept he had for vibrations, This was a while ago. And Swami said he was literally dizzy. He often just had to sit down in the first few weeks that he was there in the ashram. And then, of course, not everybody in the ashram was as finely tuned as Yogananda was. And it was actually rather a chaotic scene. So there were lots of random, interesting ideas being offered around about all kinds of things. And Swamiji didn't know how to tell the difference. So his only question was, did Master say that? And Swami said no matter how impossible it was for him to believe it, he couldn't disbelieve it. So he just set it to the side. But here is what he was doing. He was being a disciple. He was understanding that it's not that I have wasted my life, have no intelligence, have no discrimination. That's not humility. That would just be untrue. Humility is self-honesty. And for Swami to speak honestly, he was an outstandingly intelligent, competent, capable person. What could he say? He was. His brother spoke to me about him. He talked about his gift for languages and many other things was just extraordinary. So that was just a fact. But he was a disciple, and he was there to learn from one who knows that which is really true. And then as St. John, I believe, puts it in the Bible, it's so direct, speaking about Jesus. There was Jesus in the multitudes. There was Jesus with the apostles, just that. John says, as many as received him. To them he gave the power. And what you really want to say is, to them he was able to give the power. Because you see, the master has no oscillation. He has no variation. His consciousness is always the same. So the deciding factor is not what the masters are emanating. The deciding factor is how much we are firmly established in what I know to be true and stand by it and fight for it. Now, Swami has always said, he said, I prefer an honest argument to a mindless yes. And he showed himself that way, because a mindless yes is not receptivity. It's too much of a burden to be me, so I'm going to give you the burden, but nowhere in that process am I actually going to become receptive. I'm just going to live an unexamined life, but now I'll give it to you. To be truly receptive, you have to stand strong in what you already know, but the words are humility and receptivity. This is what I've always thought was true. Is it still true? And, you know, I speak from experience. There was a point about 25 years into my friendship with Swamiji when I had progressed to the point where he could say, and how exactly this came up I don't remember, although I remember exactly where we were when it came up. But, oh yes, it was just something to do with the publishing. And he said something, I would have done this years earlier, but Asha always thwarted me. Those were his words. Because Swami's primary interest, he was writing books, he was doing things, his reason for being here was us. So every decision was always made on the basis of, sure, I could stand up strong and insist, and she would do what I wanted, but I'm really trying to, what? Teach her to understand. And he was extremely sensitive in knowing when to encourage, when to discipline. And he treated me entirely different than he treated anyone else. And I don't mean I was exceptional. It's just that he knew what I needed, he knew what he needed, he knew what she needed. So you can't say Swami was this way or that way, or even said this or said that. Just depend on who was there. When I wrote down notes, I always wrote down who was in the room, because I knew who was in the room was going to determine what he said. And because I gained a lot of understanding, I would say, oh yeah, that was for that one. And to my embarrassment, as I went through, I realized, oh yeah, that one was for me. Not that I knew at the time, but I made lots of mistakes. I would have done it years earlier, but Asha always thwarted me. And because by then I was comfortable, it didn't cause me to fall into a deep depression for months, which other things did. So I just heard it, and the next morning I said, I often thwarted you, didn't I? He said, yes. I said, I owe you kind of a global apology, don't I? He said, yes. You know, just like that. But he didn't care. He didn't care how long it took, as long as I kept listening. Now, this is all a very personal story, and as I was saying earlier, this is not replicatable, it's just gone. But the principle is eternal. The principle is whenever we hear ourselves fighting for a point of view, close your mouth and ask yourself, is this really true? Just as simple as that. Is this really true? Or is this just what I've always thought? You know, like that? Because that's all the masters are trying to give us. They're just trying to get us to wake up. Just wake up, wake up, wake up. Just answer a few questions. Who am I really? What is really true? And they don't care how long it takes. We care enormously how long it takes. And we get very embarrassed. You know, just embarrassed. Even if there's nobody in the room, even if you're just all by yourself laughing, you still feel that this. Now, in the last 2 minutes here, I'm going to talk about ego. because somewhere along the line, very recently, I picked up something that I'd missed before, and this is what Swami said. Sense of self is in the 6th chakra, which is the spiritual eyes, how we think of it. And one of the wonderful subtleties that Master added to that was that the 6th chakra has 2 poles, the spiritual eye and the medulla. And the medulla is the jiva, the eternal bubble of spirit that is somehow decided it's not actually infinite, it's limited. And you can say it in all sorts of ways, but that's all it is. It's limited. It thinks it's limited. And so when the jiva is sitting in the medulla, you can say it's looking down, you can say it's looking outward, but what it's doing, it's being small. When the jiva lives at the spiritual eye, the jiva notices that it's infinite. And ego is nothing but a point of view. It's not a big rock. It's not an old rusty car in the forest. There's no thing. It's a point of view. That which I call I, is it looking outward into spirit, or is it looking downward, so to speak, into contraction? And we have to have an ego because we have to live in these bodies. We have to keep them going. This is an event for which we are responsible. But do we look downward into the smallness or upward into the greatness? And the masters, they have one job, which is expand. Don't be afraid. Come to me. Receive me. That's the only reason we're here. And the happier we'll be, the more seriously we take our job and just ask ourselves, what is true? What is true? And then live by it. God bless you.
Claim the power within.